Professor Tollefsen speak to us on the topic, whose body? So without further ado, I will hand you over to Professor Tollefsen.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the invitation, Anthony. Thank you for inviting me. When Anthony invited me and we proposed a date, I knew that I would be finishing a draft of a paper for a volume on abortion, and I still have time to change it, and that's probably, I feel that the paper tries to defend the indefensible, and then in the later parts tries to articulate the, as far as I'm concerned, ineffable. So I'm happy to receive any corrections that you have. And I have never done any form of PowerPoint in my life. It seems silly to refer to doing anything on Zoom as old school, but I'm going to read you a paper which is sort of old school. So in the philosophical dispute over abortion, there's one premise in the pro-choice argument that's almost unquestioned, namely that the body or organism in which the fetus is gestating is exclusively the mother's. There's a well-known pro-choice slogan, "My body, my choice." And this premise is essential in the argument that Judith Jarvis Thomson made famous, that a right to abortion can be sustained even if we assume the personhood of the fetus with a right to life granted. So Thomson argues that the rights attending bodily ownership are justly exercised in the decision to detach from a fetal person who has not been more or less explicitly invited to make use of the mother's body. It is not the case, as David Boonen points out, that Thomson's claim is that the right to make use of one's body outweighs or is more significant than the right to life of the fetus. Rather, the right to life doesn't entail a right to make use of the organs or body of another person. And Thomson raises a possible objection to this claim only to dismiss it. She says, "I suppose that in some views of human life, the mother's body is only on loan to her, the loan not being one which gives her any prior claim to it. One who held this view might well think it impartiality to say, I cannot choose, but I shall simply ignore this possibility. My own view is that if a human being has any just prior claim to anything at all, he has a just prior claim to his own body." Now, that attitude of dismissal that Judith Jarvis Thomson expresses here is the norm, but it's not universal. In the early 1980s, two articles put forth objections to the view that the "my" claim is entirely on the side of the mother. Jim Stone in 1983 and Mark Wickler in 1981 both argued separately that the fetus, if assumed to be a person, as Thomson does arguendo, has a claim to the organs of the mother such that those organs cannot be said to be, quote, exclusively hers, end quote. That's a quote from Wickler. And Boonen says of this objection to Thomson that it's, quote, one of the most interesting and least discussed objections to the Good Samaritan argument, end quote. And time doesn't seem to have rectified the latter, least discussed state of affairs. So in part one of this essay, I look at the original sources of the objection in Stone's and Wickler's work. I argue that if we view the debate in terms framed by the natural law tradition's understanding of property rights, then the Stone-Wickler view has much to recommend it. However, the natural law account of ownership is traditionally thought to be inhospitable to claims that one owns one's body or one's organs. As Joseph Boyle puts it, quote, "The natural law tradition contains no notion of self-ownership. The idea that the relationship of a person to one of his or her parts could be like the relationship of use that defines ownership relationships is incompatible with the special status the tradition gives to the human person, including the human body," end quote. It grieves me to be arguing really against Joe somewhat in this paper without him around to abuse me as he would willingly and gladly have done if he was still with us. Parts 2 and part 3 address this challenge that Boyle makes. In part 2, I inquire whether a sound non-dualist metaphysics of personal identity does in fact rule out property rights and organs. And I argue that a non-dualist metaphysics is compatible with property rights, understood in a Thomistic fashion, both in one's own and sometimes in another's organs. In part 3, I look at the question of self-ownership. I argue that the way in which a person comes to be related to his or her body does not justify a strong form of self-ownership. And I show that there are important symmetries between a fetus's and its mother's relationship to that mother's body and thus to the maternal organs. This symmetry justifies a similarly symmetric possessive claim on the part of the fetus to the mother's body, right, my mother's body, as that rightly made by the mother to her own, my body. The claims of mother and univocal, but neither are they entirely equivocal. Rather, there's an analogous sense of mind in the fetus's relationship to the mother's body that undercuts Thompson-style arguments for the permissibility of abortion. So part one is the organ ownership objection. In Abortion and Control of Human Bodies, Jim Stone argues that Thompson is correct that the right to life does not give any person a right to make use of the organs of another, but it does give a fetus that right. For the fetus comes into being dependent upon the organs of the mother as part of the normal process of biological reproduction, that is, in a way characteristic of members of its species. Jason, this paper owes a lot to you, since I was only able to track down this article by Jim Stone by emailing you, and you sent me a copy, so thank you. Stone supports this claim with a thought experiment involving a species that reproduces by fission. X goes out of existence at 70 years of age, and Y and Z come into being more or less fully formed, except that Z will need to rely on organs of Y for 9 months. May Y disconnect from Z prior to that, as one may disconnect from Thompson's violinist? Or does Z's right to life militate against that? Stone argues for the latter position and articulates this principle, quote, "An organism with a strong right to life has a right to the continued use of the biological equipment, the use of which it acquires through the normal process of biological creation typical to its species, upon which its life depends." And Stone thinks that this principle can be supported. A being with a strong right to life has a prima facie right to use whatever is necessary to sustain life when that use is acquired by mechanisms typical of the being's species life. So this is how, for example, I can claim a right to continue breathing air. I need the use of air to sustain my life, and I came to the use of air by way of mechanisms typical of my species life. So there's a broader principle supporting the more specific principle that has application in the abortion case on Stone's view. It's worth saying something about the content of the right. What Stone identifies as a strong right to life here, I think, needs to be understood as a Hofeldian claim right to non-interference by others in my use of, say, an organ for the maintenance of my biological life. The mother possesses this claim right, and that right will be violated if her use of her organs is interfered with to the detriment of her life. But so does the fetus possess that right on Stone's account. An abortion, understood as the argument requires as a form of disconnection rather than a form of killing, clearly violates that right. It does not, however, appear to be a right to be provided with anything. And this, I think, is important. If Stone's claim or something like it is true, then Thompson has misframed the question in addressing it in terms of whether the mother has an obligation, Good Samaritan or otherwise, to provide something to her child. Her obligation, rather, is not to interfere with the fetus's use of those parts of the mother's body on which the child's life depends. Now, Wickler relies on a similar thought experiment to Stone to again challenge the claim, quote, that a pregnant woman's body is exclusively hers, end quote. Once more, an unusual mode of reproduction is invoked. Stedians reproduce at age 40 by falling into a coma. When they awake, a clone is attached and will remain attached for 9 months, making use of the first, that's alpha, Stedian's heart, while its own develops. If detached prematurely, beta Stedian will die. Wickler affirms both that H, the heart, is alpha's, and that alpha has a prior claim to H. But he denies that alpha has an exclusive claim, for H is a vital organ with which beta is endowed by nature, just as H is a vital organ with which alpha is endowed by nature. That fact suffices to give beta a claim to H, a claim that Wickler argues is not vitiated by the fact that H is inside of alpha and not inside of beta, nor by alpha's temporal priority to beta in claiming a right to H. In particular, the latter line of thought, attributing significance to alpha's first occupancy or ownership, should not be thought to have application in the Stedian circumstances that it would otherwise have in contexts in which there, quote, is no serious scarcity, and when others aren't significantly harmed by being deprived of the use of the property at issue, end quote. In such circumstances, a right of first ownership might be reasonable, but as beta says to alpha in Wickler's imaginary dialogue between the two, quote, if the rule of first ownership were recognized here on Stet, prematurely disconnecting clones like myself might well be legitimized. But as you know, if clones are prematurely disconnected, they will die. Recognizing the rule of first ownership then would in effect place the prevention of temporary discomfort or inconvenience above the protection of life. This, it seems to me, would be a serious mistake. Any rule of ownership which would legitimize the avoidable death of innocent persons for the sake of preventing temporary discomfort or inconvenience should be rejected on ethical grounds. Hence, the rule of first ownership should not be accepted, end quote. So that's alpha speaking to beta, or no, beta speaking to alpha. Let me draw attention to a feature of this argument that I think is clearer and Wickler than Stone's development, and that I think has been overlooked by its relatively few commentators. Although metaphysical/biological factual claims play an important role in prompting intuitions in the story of the Stedians, Wickler's argument relies at the end on an independent claim about the reasonableness of conceiving of property rights in a certain way in the factual conditions described. It's because, on my reading, it would be unreasonable to grant exclusive rights to those with first occupancy or ownership in the circumstances as described in the Stedian case, that the rule of ownership, quote, should not be accepted, the rule that first ownership gives you exclusive rights. Right? But in this argument, as I'm understanding it, there's no straightforward inference from the factual description to the moral norm. In this, Wickler's position reflects, perhaps intentionally, but probably not, an important thread in the natural law traditions thought about private property, namely that property should be considered private in possession or ownership, but common in use. Thomas Aquinas considered social arrangements involving private property generally more reasonable than schemes of common ownership, on grounds that owning in common creates confusion, quarrels, and a lack of care. However, the goods of the earth are, on Aquinas' view, to be for the benefit of all, and this is precisely why some scheme of private property is required by reason. That is, avoiding quarrels, confusion, and lack of care by means of private ownership is demanded by reason in consideration of the need for the goods of the earth to serve common use. The requirement that the goods of the earth serve common use also grounds Aquinas' view that in emergency conditions, material goods that are the property of one may be used by another to satisfy his need. Aquinas writes that, quote, it is not theft, properly speaking, to take secretly and use another's property in a case of extreme need, because that which he takes for the support of his life becomes his own property by reason of this need. In this way, the underlying use of the world's natural resources remains common. Now, I think one can see echoes of this in Wickler's analysis. If there is a commonly identifiable situation in which one person can readily be anticipated to have an urgent need of something in possession of another, and in which, generally speaking, that something can be used by the one in need without creating equally urgent need on the part of the prior owner, then it would be unreasonable to grant exclusive rights of use to the prior owner. In keeping with the most fundamental norm concerning the earth's goods, the one in need has a right claim to non-interference in the use of the good in question. This situation applies in the case of fetuses, who almost always come to exist in a state of need in regard to the use of certain organs otherwise possessed by the mother. It would thus be unreasonable for an understanding of the mother's ownership or property rights in those organs to exclude that use in the way that Thompson's argument attempts to justify. And if one were to follow Aquinas' general line of thought, one might say of the maternal organs, quote, that which the fetus takes for the support of his life becomes his own property by reason of this need, end quote. So there appear to be reasons for thinking that the fetus has a claim right to non-interference in the use of the maternal organs. However, this response raises a question. Is the my used by the mother in describing her body and her organs best or entirely, or even at all, to be understood the my that we use in relationship to our property? Aquinas himself discusses property in terms of a relation of persons to exterior things, which bodily organs are not obviously an instance of. Perhaps it's the case that if we see the question of how to think of the mother's organs as a question of reasonable appropriation of natural resources, in the way that I've been suggesting, then the issue unfairly privileges the fetus in a way that would be corrected by thinking of the my as the my of identity. My body is what I am, not simply what I have, possess, or own. And perhaps that more fundamental claim of identity itself provides a more adequate framework from which to think about the mother's and the fetus's entitlements. So part 2 is on the mother's body. Suppose we accept the basic premise of animalism, that you and I are identical to the organism that is respectively reading or hearing this talk right now. Then it seems that the mother is identical with the organism that the fetus occupies, and the fetus is identical with a different organism. And my own work on embryo and abortion ethics over the years has relied upon this sort of claim. In Embryo, Defense of Human Life, Robbie George and I argued that an embryo is not part of the mother because both the mother and the fetus, mother and the embryo are individual, whole, genetically distinct organisms of the human species. It's precisely for this reason, namely that the embryo is a human being possessed of a human nature, that it has basic, absolute, and unalienable human rights, such as the right not to be deliberately killed when it poses no significant threat to another's well-being. On such account, both the mother and the fetus straightforwardly have parts of their own, identifiable as such, because while they're not identical with the organism as a whole, they play some functional role in the biological economy of that organism. At the earliest stages, zygotes and embryos have a cell or cells and a membrane, the zona pellucida, as parts. The embryo is, however, the executor of its own subsequent growth and development, and that development includes the growth of new organs and organ systems. The fully developed human organism is, of course, highly complex with many different organic parts, and the mother may rightly say of those parts that they are hers precisely because together they compose the organism that she is. And the fetus can say the same thing about the parts that compose the organism that she is, or he. So understood, the parts of an organism are not obviously exterior things in the way that the material realities of the external world are. They're parts of one's personal reality, which encompasses one's material organic existence. Are entitlements akin to property rights in one's bodily organs even possible when thinking from such a non-dualistic standpoint? Or must exterior things be construed quite strictly to encompass only things exterior to one's bodily boundaries? A case that suggests something quite but not entirely similar to property rights is the right persons have to alienate certain of their organs, such as a kidney, blood plasma, or bone marrow in organ donation. Most non-dualists accept the moral permissibility of such organ donation on condition that the donation be entirely informed and voluntary, and that the risks be not too great to the donor. Many of those who accept the permissibility of such donation also hold that such donation cannot morally be financially compensated. And this creates the impression that the relationship of the donor to the donated part is not a property relationship. However, it's difficult to see why, if the organ can be alienated as a gift, it cannot also be alienated for money. For example, how could it be permissible to donate a kidney to one's child, but impermissible to sell the kidney in order to pay for a life-saving operation for one's child? And that's the example is from Joe Boyle. Could it be reasonable to see this relationship between a person and her non-vital organs as a genuine relationship of ownership in the sense discussed by St. Thomas? One might think that a salient difference is that my kidney cannot be appropriated by another in grave need, as exterior forms of property can be in an emergency. Nor does there seem to be any prospect that redistributive justice could require that another be given the use of my kidney without my consent. But this seems too quick. For if we consider the reasons why other persons may not appropriate my organs in an emergency, and why the state may not redistribute ownership rights to my organs, then I think we see the rationale complements, like a puzzle piece to its match, the account given earlier of a fetus's claim to non-interference in using the maternal organs. For no person other than the fetus could, without permission, make use of those organs or appropriate them for a third person's use without a violation of the organ owner's bodily integrity. This is precisely what happens in the violinist case. Occupying the position of the person whom the violinist is using, my organs exist within a space that I occupy. Typically, the only way to those organs is through me, and that's what happens in the violinist case. But whatever else may be the case, this is not the fetus's root. No fetus conceived in a mother's womb has invaded the mother's personal space, the space that the mother occupies in order to gain access to the mother's organs. Rather, the fetus comes into existence within that space, and coming into existence traverses no personal boundaries. Even the subsequent burrowing of the embryo's syncytiotropoblast into the uterine lining during implantation is not like the penetration of outer boundaries of an organism, such as might take place in, for example, a surgical operation. Rather, already biologically finding itself within the maternal body space, so to speak, the fetus makes use, without infringing the mother's bodily integrity, of what, on a Thomistic account of property, well, my Thomistic account of property for the purposes of this paper, he or she is entitled to, given the nature of his or her biological needs. The embryo or fetus thus exists in a uniquely privileged position relative to the maternal organs if we concede the legitimacy of the private property analogy. At the same time, that analogy does not prove too much, for there are principled reasons against any other agent's appropriation. Are there also reasons against the mother treating all of her bodily parts as if they were property to be alienated at will, perhaps by donating or selling vital organs to another person? I think there are. The mother's vital organs in general play a much more central role in her survival and flourishing than does any particular exterior thing. And while it could be reasonable, as discussed above, for a person to donate or even sell non-vital organs, it's difficult or impossible to see how the side effects of donating a vital organ could in general be proportionate so as to justify an agent in alienating such organs. But it's not obvious to me that if a situation existed in which, say, one of my bodily organs could be used by another to save his life without either impacting my own life prospects or violating my bodily integrity, that it would be wrong for that other agent to make temporary use of my organ. So if Thompson's famous violinist is in the same surgical theater as me, while I'm undergoing an operation which requires temporary removal of my kidneys, and all of a sudden, those kidneys are urgently but only temporarily needed by surgeons to save his life, then perhaps those kidneys could be said to become, quote, his own property by reason of this need, end quote, again, quoting from Aquinas. The consent that would be ordinarily required to be required for any permissible use of another's organ might, in this admittedly unlikely scenario, not be necessary. The part 3. The discussion so far has concerned a question of ownership, and the valence of that discussion has primarily been moral, as characterized as the Thomistic tradition of thought on property rights. Ownership for Aquinas is properly a set of rights concerning, as Finis puts it, quote, management and distribution and use for consumption, end quote. Correlative to these rights are oughts, typically to non-interference of various sorts. Ownership is not a deep or metaphysical relationship. It's a moral relationship. And I've argued that so understood, the fetus's relationship to certain organs of the mother is well understood as a set of rights to make use of those organs with correlative obligations of non-interference on the part of the mother. Indeed, it's precisely the moral nature of that relationship that makes fetal rights to maternal organs co-assertable with the identity claim that characterizes the mother's relationship to her body. That identity relationship is not construed as a form of exclusive self-ownership. Yet, on a different line of thought, identity and self-ownership are so closely implicated as to be almost one and the same. One's sovereignty with respect to one's body is near absolute. Any form of coercion of me and my bodily existence is tantamount to a form of slavery on such an approach, an appropriation of what, in an absolute sense, does not belong to the appropriator. From this standpoint, the mother's body is absolutely hers in a way that it can never be in relation to the fetus. And for the fetus to use it without consent would again be tantamount to something similar to slavery. Now, this final section addresses the question of what we might call the metaphysics of self-ownership. It's no more than a preliminary discussion, a sketch of some considerations that suggest two complementary claims. First, a claim of any person to self-ownership of his or her body in any deep metaphysical sense is offset by every person's ultimate inability to own the fact that this is his or her body. Each person is radically unanswerable for the fact of their bodily existence and the relation in which they stand into their particular body. Second, although manifestly each person still stands in a vastly more intimate relation to his or her body than almost every other person stands into that body, there is one exception. A fetus exists to his or her mother's body in very much a similar relation to that in which the mother exists in relation to her own body. Thus, the metaphysical gap, as it were, between maternal and fetal ownership of the mother's body is not as great as we might think. What connects both claims is a symmetry between how a person's body comes to be his or her body and the way in which a person comes to have a mother's body. So let me begin by explaining this expression, which is ambiguous. In one obvious sense, I can speak of my mother's body. That refers to the body of my mother, her body, which was hers prior to my coming into existence and continues as hers during the period that her and my earthly life overlap. But I want to use the expression my mother's body, where quotations are around mother's body, to refer to something that we could understand as my mother's body insofar as it is a mothering body to me, the body in which I came into existence, and which is for some months essential to my life's continued existence. Prior to 1978, every human being who was born began his or her life in such a mothering body. And of that body, it would make plain sense for the fetal person to say, if he or she could speak, that this is my mother's body. So I'll use the expression my mother's body to refer to the body that's my mother's, and my mother's body to refer to the mothering body that is mine, speaking as if from the standpoint of myself in utero. My mother's relationship to her body and my in utero relation to my mother's body are, I will argue, similar in ways that undermine the metaphysical claim of unique self-ownership made by my mother in relation to her body. Corresponding claims to near absolute sovereignty over her body are thus also undermined. So let's begin with a fact about the human person as it exists in its full maturity. Germaine Grisey and John Finnis have both in a number of places drawn attention to an important passage in which St. Thomas discusses order and the way in which mind relates to order. According to Aquinas, there are 4 such orders. First is the order of nature, which mind knows or can know, but does not create. Second, the order that is introduced by mind into its consideration, includes logic, categorical relations, and the like. Third, the order introduced into the will and thence into action by practical reason through deliberation and choice. And fourth, the order that mind introduces in order to serve various purposes into the material stuff of the world in art and technique. Now, the person can be said to exist in all 4 orders. For persons have a bodily order or bodily reality, which is in the first order. They're minded and have cognitive openness to the world, it's the second order. They constitute themselves through their choices as the persons that they are, the third order. And they creatively reshape both themselves and their material world in art and technique, the fourth order. And in all 4 orders, the person's existence is reflexive. Most prominently, the mind knows that it knows and knowing, reflexively wills and willing, and is aware of itself and its engagement with the world and making. But even in the first order, sentient living bodies display some reflexivity when, for example, they recalibrate their position in relation to something in virtue of sensory experience, as when a dog shifts its position and perspective to continue tracking a moving object. For the mature human person, that sensory reflexivity shapes and is shaped by the person's existence in the second, third, and fourth orders, as when the cognitive, volitional, or technical possibilities available to the person are structured by bodily facts about that person, or as when a person deliberately shifts her bodily position in order to gain a better epistemic, agential, or technical vantage point on the situation. In each of these 4 orders, then, the human person is reflexive. But it's in the second, third, and fourth orders that reflexivity is most obviously personal and self-conscious. By contrast, in the first order, human persons exist for a period of time with no self-conscious reflexivity at all, not even the sensory reflexivity characteristic of non-personal organisms. And so philosophers, when thinking about what it means to be a person and the conditions under which one exists as a person, are often tempted to hold that persons only come into exist when one or another or all forms of self-conscious reflexivity characteristic of persons comes to exist, which is some considerable time clearly after the beginning of the existence of the human organism, an entity that exists in the first order, independent of any activity of mind. Now, I reject that conclusion, which entails an indefensible dualism. My body is, in fact, a part of me. It's not other than I, though what I am transcends my bodily reality. Nevertheless, I wish to draw attention to this independence in its originating condition of the person in the first order from any of the characteristics of the other 3 orders. The initial coming into being of the person as a bodily organism radically establishes the third person factual conditions in which the radically first personal self-reflexive I of the other 3 orders finds itself, and with, in, and through which it must live and act during the rest of its bodily existence. One's entire life in the second, third, and fourth orders continues to be conditioned by the radical contingency and facticity of the state of affairs that this organism is me. My first personal life seems radically to transcend my bodily condition, And yet I existed as bodily before ever being able to consider myself as myself. And I didn't exist prior to that organism's coming into existence either. My body is I, but I also transcend that body. And so it's reasonable, I think, for me to consider my body to be mine. Yet its being mine is something for which I'm neither answerable nor accountable. I can take no ownership of it. It is me by no act of mine, and it's me prior to any thought of it as mine. And it's mine and me through what has to be understood as the most fantastic contingency imaginable, the union of one of approximately 250 million sperm with an oocyte at one particular moment in one particular place. Even those two agents most responsible for the event that brought me into existence themselves can take no ownership of the event in question. They chose neither the event nor me. At the same time, there's no I, not this one, without precisely that contingency. I could not have come into existence save through exactly that fantastically improbable event. Contingency and necessity are thus intertwined in the interplay between my identity as I exist in the first order as a living organism and my thinking, choosing, and making identities. Started. This body is me and mine, yet I can take no ownership of it, no responsibility for the fact of its being mine. While I transcend my body, its facticity and sheer contingency also transcend because they precede and establish my person in the second, third, and fourth orders. For the reflexivity characteristic of me in those orders is radically dependent upon that facticity and contingency of my existence in the first order. And these claims are equally true, of course, in regard to my mother and her body. And taken together, they suggest something less than the picture of absolute self-sovereignty and self-ownership. Yes, my body is mine, as my mother's is hers. But they are our bodies in ways that, as I have said, we can take no ownership of. Rather, they're ours in what I will characterize as a radically unbidden way, more akin to a gift than to something that we've taken possession of. And in a footnote, I say that I think something like this is also true of the relationship between the goods of the earth and all individual human beings, and that something like this is the metaphysics that underwrites the idea of the universal destination of the world's goods. Now, what I'll now, in conclusion, argue is that this way in which our bodies are ours is strongly paralleled in the relationship of a fetus to his or her mother's body. Thus, consider me as I came into existence in relation to specifically my mother's body. At precisely the moment at which I came to be as this organism, I stood in relation to my mother's body with that same combination of contingency and necessity that I stand in relation to my own body, and that she stands in relation to hers. For I could have come into existence in no other way. Any other organism that came into existence in her body at that time could not have been me, nor could I have come into existence in the body of some other mother at that or any other time. Even the window within which I could have come into existence within my mother's body was radically limited. My existence is linked of necessity to a contingent relationship to my mother's body that at the same time necessarily could not have been otherwise without my non-existence. Now it follows that I can take no ownership of my relationship to my mother's body. I chose her no more than she chose me. Yet, again, from the vantage of my first coming into existence, her body is also at the same time uniquely mine in the category of mother's body. She's my mother's body. No other organism at that time can stand in that relationship to her, except mutatis, a twin, and I can stand in no similar relationship at that or any other time to some other mother's body. So there are intriguing symmetries between my mother's relationship to our own bodies and my relationship to my mother's body, a relationship that she, of course, had to her mother's body. The symmetries include the radical unbiddenness of a person's relationship to both his or her body and to her mother's body. I neither chose nor was chosen by her, just as she did not choose her own body, nor was it chosen for her. And this, I'm suggesting, means that her claim to her body ultimately rests on a foundation that is similar to my claim to her body, the sheer facticity of having come into existence in an identity and dependence relationship with that body. There's asymmetry, of course, for the mother's identity relationship with her body is a true identity relation, whereas my identity relation to her body is somewhat different. I would not have an identity relation with my own body, save for my relationship to her and her body. But in both cases, the relationship is unasked for. It's unbidden, contingent, out of our control. And here's what seems to me to be the metaphysical upshot. Because in the deepest sense, she can take no ownership of her own biological identity as this organism, there's no metaphysical ground on which to base a claim to absolute sovereignty over her body. So any metaphysical objection based on identity to the fetus's property rights in its mother's body is avoided. At the same time, my in utero relation to my mother's, in my in utero relation to my mother's body, I can assert genuine, though certainly not exclusive, rights to her body insofar as it's needed to sustain my life in its earliest stages. So recall Thompson's claim, quote, "My own view is that if a human being has any just prior claim to anything at all, he has a just prior claim to his own body," end quote. My argument in this section, like my argument in the previous sections, questions this claim. During pregnancy, two or more, if there are twins or triplets or what have you, two or more persons have an equally just claim to the mother's body, the mother and those human beings for whom that body is their mother's body. And given that relationship, eviction is unjust. I do have a quick postscript that I'll read, less than a page. I think we have time. Or a quick postscript on in vitro fertilization and how it might relate to some of what I've been saying. So as mentioned, prior to 1978, every human person came into existence with a mother's body, which was his or hers. But beginning in 1978, some persons have come into existence in a petri dish. Their bodily identity is related, certainly, to the identity of their biological mother, but their existence lacks the unbiddenness that is characteristic of human coming to be. And importantly, for the argument of this essay, their subsequent existence within a maternal body also lacks that unbiddenness, for it comes to pass only as the result of a specifically consented to act in which the embryo is inserted into the mother. She accepts this embryo into her person in a manner similar to the owner of a domicile who accepts boarders on her own terms. Those terms include the permitted use of her organs by the embryo, who is the object of the transfer, rather than, as in the case that I've been describing, the making use by right of those organs. That embryo's relationship to his or her gestational mother's organs is thus radically different from that of each human person's relationship to the organs of his or her mother's body. That is, each unborn human being who is not the result of in vitro fertilization or some similar form of assisted reproduction. I believe that the picture that I've put forward, both in the sections of the paper that discussed the unborn person's property rights in maternal organs, and in the third section's discussion of the unborn person's mother's body, is a picture of radical equality between unborn and maternal persons. I can't defend the claim here, but it seems to me that ARTs in which a child comes into existence outside the body of her biological mother radically impair that relationship of equality. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Tollefsen, for a very rich and interesting presentation. Would anyone like to make an initial comment, or if not, I have several. Professor Mascella?
Yes, thanks, Chris. I really enjoyed the paper. It's extremely thought-provoking, and as you know, I've done some work on reproductive technologies, so I particularly find that last postscript very provocative and makes me want to write more about it. But so I could have many comments, but I'll start with just two. So one is with regard to the postscript. What you wrote, I found very interesting, particularly in light of a number of the comments made by people who have used reproductive technologies to have children. In particular, I'm thinking of an article that I would be happy to send you that came out in the New York Times Magazine a number of years ago called The 2-1 Pregnancy, which discusses the unfortunately relatively common practice of reducing twin pregnancies, which are more frequent with reproductive technologies, down to singleton pregnancies. And there is a very telling, I think, comment of one of the women who made this choice, which seems to me to indicate precisely the point that you make in the paper. So she says something along the lines of, well, if we had conceived naturally, I probably wouldn't have reduced this pregnancy, because it would have just seemed that, well, you know, there's a kind of natural order of things and we didn't choose it and it just happened, and so I should somehow let it go. But since all of this was also kind of manufacturer product-like, and we were kind of dominating, controlling the whole process throughout, it seemed like, well, this was just one more choice that was ours to make. So I do find that to be, I mean, anecdotal, but evocative of that lack of equality that exists in IVF by contrast with natural procreation. The second question is one about what your view of our kind of limited property rights in our organs would imply for certain sorts of research uses of our body parts in cases where the parts are obtained legitimately and where there's no violation of privacy in the use. So I'm thinking, for instance, about controversies over the Henrietta Lacks cell line, right? The cell line derived from the cancerous uterus cells of Henrietta Lacks. And presumably those cells were obtained legitimately, right, through a legitimate medical procedure that was done for Henrietta's benefit. But then the controversy is that they were subsequently used and taken and made into an immortal cell line without Henrietta Lacks's consent. Well, it would seem like on the view that you propose, there isn't any clear reason why we should require consent for that kind of use. There's no privacy issue, no threat to her bodily integrity. It was legitimately taken. So are we wrong to think that the unconsensual use was problematic? Or is there something else that would explain the problematic nature of that?
Yeah. Oh, thanks. That's great. That's very helpful. So on the first one, yeah, I mean, the little postscript there is moving claims that are familiar about IVF as such just further into the domain of the transfer. I think that move, and maybe we can talk about this as well. And in reading over the paper and thinking about it for the context of this presentation, and Helen, knowing that you were on it, I thought, I hope this doesn't raise any problems for my view about embryo transfer or embryo adoption. I think it raises problems for them, but not undefeatable problems. I think it does raise the problem though. I mean, if you are engaged in embryo transfer or embryo adoption in ways that replicate this idea that the person is being invited to share your organs on your own terms, then I think you're replicating the problem that exists in an earlier stage of ARTs. And so that indicates, I mean, I think embryo adoption in particular can overcome this, right? Because you can see the child as a gift in the same way that you do in other forms of adoption. But that's just a sort of side note. I mean, I think the example that you give, Melissa, is really nice. I have to confess, I mean, your question about the Henrietta Lacks cells is interesting and worrisome because it articulates exactly the same thought that I've had about this. I mean, I read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks for a class that I was teaching for another professor, and I had a hard time getting worked up about any injustice that was done as such to her. It seems that once those cells are alienated, that they really are no longer hers in any of the senses that I'm talking about. They are now really truly exterior things of the world. And there seem to be good reasons for making use of them in ways that are going to be beneficial to everybody. That doesn't mean that, if there's some way that also can specially benefit the person from whom they were received, it doesn't mean that there's no reason to do that. But it's not obvious to me that there's a moral wrong being done in making use of those cells once they've been once they've been alienated to the people who are working on them. I'm totally open to being shown that that's a vile vile position to take, but that was just how I responded when I first read that book.
Yeah, I have to say that I kind of shared your initial response, that my sense of that there was that, part of the problem was simply the confusion on the part of her children who lacked the requisite education to understand what was going on, and thinking that somehow their mother was still alive, right? Still in those cells, which of course is clearly false metaphysically. But yeah, that I've never been able to get as worked up about that as lots of other people, given that the cells were obtained in ways that were perfectly legitimate.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Jason.
Yes, thanks so much, Chris. That was a great paper. So yeah, kind of building on Melissa's last point. Yeah, I was thinking, what other implications your view has for, again, how we can construe ownership, or maybe a better term is stewardship of our bodies. And so I'm just going to throw two more potentially problematic cases at you, or maybe not problematic, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are. So one is, you may be aware of Dave Hirschanov's and Jim Delaney's argument some years back in A Job about organ conscription, and basically saying, look, once you're dead and so on, you have no interest continuing into these organs. And if there's a compelling societal interest, right, in these organs, then we don't even need consent, right? We don't need explicit opt-in, or we can just take them, right? Because your period of stewardship over this body is done. And I kind of backed up that view, bringing in, Thomistic metaphysics to say, yeah, look, our resurrected bodies are made of wholly new matter. It doesn't matter where these organs go, right? And so that's one implication, right? That it's we're exercising a unwarranted degree of ownership, of neoliberal ownership over our bodies, to say that consent in whatever form from us or our family is required to take our organs after our death. And then the other implication, maybe a bit more now problematic, a bit more loose, is our bodies in relation to the surrounding community in which we're embedded. And so obviously in time of COVID, public health concerns, thinking of, to what extent can, again, legitimate societal authorities in a public health crisis require that things be done to our bodies, like vaccine mandates, right? Now, that last question, I would approach, I would bracket off things like allowing religious moral exemptions and so on like that. I'm not saying it should not be exemptions to mandates or anything, but simply saying that, look, if we have good data that a vaccine, it may not even be COVID-19, just whatever, a vaccine is safe, effective, de minimis risk to the person getting the vaccine, and there's this great public health benefit to everyone, or at least 80-90% of people being vaccinated, does, again, my individual stewardship right over my body, does that get attenuated by the legitimate public authority exercising their role to say, you need to get this vaccine? So just a couple of cases I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah, thanks. On the first one, again, I'm sympathetic to that, although I think that the natural repository of authority over a person's corpse is their family. Now, I do think that the family can override, say, a lack of consent on the part of a person to donation. I think if they're, if the family thinks there's a good reason to donate, but the person had previously said that they didn't want to donate, I think the family can override that. They can also override in the other direction under some circumstances. But I guess the implication of that, I hadn't thought about this, but I think I would probably be willing to concede that given important and exigent enough circumstances, that the authority of the state could override the authority of the family for making use of organs of the corpse, if that was something from which a great good could be derived. And I don't think I'd have a principled objection to that. I think that seems to fall off. I think I don't know. Look, audiences, groups of people that share immense amounts of things in common, in the US at least, are incredibly divided about vaccine mandates. But it's surely no crazier than anything else that I've said in the paper for me to say that I actually have no problem at all with them. I think that, you know, they fall within the authority of the police powers of the state to protect, among other things, health and welfare of the people, and that includes that, you know, that extends to certain kinds of, you know, fairly, it seems to me, fairly light coercion of people's bodies. Most of the, or at least many of the mandates that are being considered have some form of opt-out. It's not as if they, you know, tie you down and make you take the vaccine. In the worst case, you won't be able to keep your job, but in many cases, you will be able to keep your job as long as you get tested on a regular basis. That doesn't seem to me something that that even warrants a religious exemption, right? You can get tested. That seems fine. Is there? I guess what I'm not sure about is whether there's anything specifically in the paper that bears on that. And I'm not sure that the claims that I make about property rights and organs take that argument any further than just a claim that in a state, a legitimate state, the state has authority to pursue certain aspects of the common good that justifies its use of coercion in certain ways, that, you know, up to and including certain forms of bodily coercion. And I guess I'm not sure that anything that I said moves that claim further down the road.
Yeah, no, and admittedly, that was a looser extension of your argument.
Yeah.
And I agree with you 100% about the mandates. I've written a couple op-eds on this myself. And I was also going to add one of my students, I just put this in the chat, Paul Riffin, published an article in the latest issue of NCBQ, in which Helen also has a piece on organ donation and family consent and so on. His view is very much in line with kind of what you just outlined, and he takes on the Delaney Hirschenoff argument. So you may want to check that out. Thanks, Chris.
Great, thanks.
Yes, I wonder if I could jump in now just on the reproductive technology kind of angle, because I wonder to what extent your claim on your mother's body is about originating in your mother's body, and to what extent it's about the body via which you came to be. So the IVF embryo has a moral claim, even in the freezer. You know, the IVF embryo has some moral claim on its mother's body. Now, it's not absolute, because there might be too many embryos, or the mother might be very ill, or whatever, but because she's the mother. And I certainly wouldn't want there to be any diminution in the rights of an already implanted IVF embryo. So, you know, because that embryo didn't come to be within the mother's body, I don't think that should say anything at all about its claim on the mother now it's in. And I would extend that to the claim of the embryo on the gestational mother, even if she's not genetically related. You know, and even if she shouldn't have had the embryo transferred, she's its mother now, or one of its mothers. So yes, I mean, I think it is. I think it's about your claim on your mother more than about where you came to be. I think where you came to be is relevant in that, as you say, you know, making someone pregnant does involve an intervention on their body, which they have to authorize, even if they're morally obliged to authorize it in many cases. But you know, it's a claim on your mother that I think counts. And it also occurred to me that even with IVF, you mentioned that there isn't the kind of givenness that there is with natural conception. But of course, IVF parents as well can't choose the exact embryo who will be conceived. You know, with ICSI, they can choose the sperm and the ovum, but they can't choose the exact millisecond, you know, in which that person will be conceived. So they, just like the naturally conceiving people, they can't choose. You know, if you like, exactly what child will be conceived. So I wonder whether you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, that's very helpful. That seems largely right, that it's the fact of the mother relationship that is doing most of the work. I think that I don't think I have a good answer, but I think what I want to say is that the effort to gain control over that and the effort to remove it from the space in which it happens are very closely linked, right? And so that the relationship of being a mother, insofar as it's carried out without the attempt to bring inappropriate forms of control into that relationship, is one that that has to respect certain facts of place. That it's going to be one in which the fact of being in the mother is actually tied up with the normative way of becoming a mother. But I take your point. I think that's a nice objection, and I need to think more about that, because I am certainly and I'm not trying to downplay the role that being a mother is playing in this situation, but I am trying to say something more than that says about place and its relationship to how the fetus stands in relationship to the mother, and specifically the mother's organs. I think more about that. Thank you. That's good.
Melissa.
Yeah, just a quick thought on that point. I mean, it seems like what Helen was saying about, in a sense, the right of the fetus to the mother's body, simply because it's the mother, simply because she's the mother, even if the fetus was conceived outside of her body, I think is still reconcilable with what I take to be the key insight in that postscript. Because I think you can distinguish between the objective right on the part of the fetus to have use of his or her mother's body. I mean, you could sort of make that argument along the lines that I make about the special obligations that biological parents have simply by being biological parents. But then I think your point is more about the kind of intentional structure of the mother's will and broader attitude toward the child that she has conceived in a petri dish through IVF rather than in the natural way, and that kind of intentional structure places her is a kind of intentional structure that fails to fully respect the equality of the child and gives her undue control over the process. In other words, that the fact that she can choose whether or not to allow the embryo to use her body is already a form of domination over the embryo that she ought not to have. That she ought not to be actively able to choose not to let it in, because it really does belong there. So I don't know. I mean, those are just thoughts of
yeah. So I guess that's helpful. I mean, it helps me to think of, I mean, sort of maybe one more thing to say, because I want to say all those things, but also I do want to say that the way in which the unborn child can say of its mother's body that it's mine is shaped in a real way by having come into existence within that mother's body. Now, the child, I mean, if we imagine that all of these embryos can, can think and speak, right, in a way that I think is somewhat permitted by the Judith Jarvis Thomson setup, right? There are my claims that the claim in the embryo, or that the embryo in the petri dish can make, right? That's my mother, right? And so she owes me a spot in the house or in the body. But I mean, here's maybe an analogy. If I throw one of my kids out of the house, right, unjustly, they have various rights claims, and they can say in certain ways that make perfectly sense, I've been thrown out of my house, right? but it's no longer their house in the way that it's my house for the kids who are still in the house, right? There's something about that relationship, about having not been, about first of all, having been, come into existence as members of the domicile, right? And never having been alienated from the domicile, that even apart from concerns of what someone is entitled to, establishes a kind of ownership or possession, and these seem like the wrong words in certain ways because they seem a little impersonal and cold, right? But establishes a form of possession that the kids who are still in the house have, that now the child who's out of the house doesn't have, even if they have exactly the same rights to be in the house. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at, and that does seem to me to go beyond the fact of motherhood to something about the way in which, when one comes into existence in one's mother, right, one is like coming to be in a home that is thereby one's own, right, as opposed to the child who comes into being, out of their home, right, and is entitled to it, but doesn't have it in the same way, right? It's not theirs in quite the same way that it is for the child who comes into existence present in their own home.
I mean, so maybe you could say that a part of the injustice to the child in IVF is that it is created homeless in this sense, right? It is created without a mother's body,
right?
Or without,
yes, no, I think that's right, and
in the way
it has to
it
be
would have
allowed
a right
back
to be
in.
created with a mother's body, right? And so that's part of the injustice.
Yes, and for the child who's been kicked out of the house unjustly, that, even if there's reconciliation and everything comes back, right, there's something that the children to whom that's never happened have, and always will have, that the child to whom that's happened no longer has it in some, and what I want to say is some kind of ontological sense, although admittedly I'm struggling to identify that in the clearest possible way.
May I ask a question on this thing? What if a couple decide to do IVF because of medical reasons? Because the mother, for instance, has a disease that can be transferred to the fetus. So the idea to do the IVF is to give to the embryo more chance to survive. So and I'm saying this in relation to what Helen said about the fact that the embryo, in a sense, as a kind of answer his mother, and
Yeah, well, I take a hard line on IVF, regardless of the motivations, I'm afraid. I do think that regardless of the motivations, it's an attempt to make something that is a sort of thing that shouldn't be made. It's an attempt to exert a certain kind of control over the coming into being of a person. And I think normatively, the only way in which a person can come into existence that fully respects the fact of their personhood and the absolute transcendence of their existence as a person over any artifact, is in fact through the sexual intercourse of spouses. Right? That's the context in which they can be brought into being, both as the fruition of an act that is a realization of the good of marriage, but also as a result of an act that in no way can be seen as a form of production or construction of a human person. And so I think there's lots of different reasons, some good, some bad, that people contracept. And there's lots of different reasons, some good and some bad, that people engage in assisted reproductive technologies that I think are ultimately not humanizing to the human being that comes about as a result of those.
Chris, I wonder whether Ilaria, sorry, Melissa, you're muted.
Oh yes, I was gonna. You can go ahead. No, nothing. Go ahead. I'll go next.
No, I was just thinking that that Ilaria's point is maybe that there may be no home for the embryo to go to, no safe home for the embryo to go to. But I suppose Professor Tollefsen would be saying, you know, that this is still not a respectful way for an embryo to be conceived, because it's still too much like the manufacture of an object. But it's true, of course, that no one that yes, not every woman has a home, even if she can. And you know, many mothers of IVF embryos may not anymore be able to gestate their embryos. But sorry, I'm Melissa.
Well, I mean,
yeah. So I was. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think there are millions of homeless embryos. And I mean, the comment that I made in response to Melissa's first question about embryo adoption is that I think the attempt to give them a home needs to be normatively shaped. I mean, if anything that I've said in this paper is correct in the last section, at least, or, you know, the last two sections, needs to be shaped by a concern that that giving the embryo a home is not like it's, I mean, the word rescue seems to me problematic, right? I mean, that also in some way restores a kind of inequality, right? That if the giving of a home, giving of a maternal womb home to an embryo needs to, in whatever way, be carried out in such a way that the receiver of the embryo is as much being gifted with something as the embryo itself is, or else you get again this kind of asymmetry that you get in ART more generally. Does that you see what I'm trying to get at there? Is that
I see what you're getting at, Chris, there. Although I'm not sure. So I mean, I think of the analogy with foster care. So it's not clear that providing a home normatively has to include the commitment to provide a home forever, right? So just as foster care would be morally legitimate and you need not commit to forever taking care of this child,
right?
I don't see why the analogy couldn't hold for gestation, saying, well, I'm not sure that I can take on the commitment to care for this child for the whole of its life, but I can commit to caring for this child during the period of gestation.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think
Isn't,
that's right.
isn't this all about whether pregnancy makes you a mother? And if it does, you know, is this a good way of becoming a mother? Because if pregnancy makes you a mother, then you're not like the foster mother in inverted commas, you know, caring for a child for a few months. You know, you're someone who is very seriously committed to the child. And then, you know, if you are very seriously committed to the child and have become a mother of that child, then the question is, just as IVF, you know, seems an inappropriate way of becoming a mother, you know, doesn't this other technical procedure look like an inappropriate way of becoming a mother? Yes, I suppose we can look at things, you know, for example, you know, surrogates who break surrogacy contracts. You know, why does it seem wrong to take the baby from the surrogate? See, arguably because she's become the mother, you know, or you know, one of the mothers or the last mother holding the baby. You might disagree.
I mean, well, I mean, I have many thoughts on this, but I don't know if Chris, I don't want to steal the mic here.
No. You had something else next, Melissa. So I'm happy to hear what you were going to say.
Yeah. So I mean, the other thing was just a small point, a suggestion that you might want to address, even in just a footnote, to ward off what I might take to be an easily responded to criticism that people might likely think of as they're reading the paper, which is the case of rape. People might say, well, in that case, there was a violation of bodily integrity, right? That the child came in illicitly, right? But of course, I mean, your response to that, I think, should be obvious, which is it's not the child, but the sperm that came in illicitly. Right. But I do think it's worth addressing explicitly to just ward off that line.
Right. Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, actually, in the Stone, I think it's in the Stone article, Wickler doesn't mention this. And the thing that would be analogous would be if somebody did take an IVF baby and implant it without the consent of the woman, right? Then, although it's not the child's fault, right, there is something parallel to an invasion of bodily integrity and inviolability that happens in that, and it, you know, clearly would be a wrong. I think that's actually, I mean, it's morally difficult to know what to do in that situation. It seems to me that that is possibly a situation in which some sort of expulsion is morally warranted, although it would have obviously profoundly terrible consequences for the child. But that does seem that unlike a child coming into being as a result of rape does seem more like something that's traversing the physical boundaries in a way that brings about a pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I suppose again we have to. Isn't this about whether you become a mother by gestating an embryo? If that makes you a mother, then you have maternal duties to the embryo. You know, who's a result of, you know, forcible impregnation. You know, whether by rape or whether by some kind of IVF procedure. Yes, I mean, yes, I mean, even if you're not the genetic mother, so your body is not oriented to the child in that way, you know, your body is oriented to the child now.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it seems to me that you become a mother in a sense, right? But not the paradigm sense, and that makes a difference. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that a surrogate mother who is not genetically related to the child and has done this in order, you know, to receive money, is a mother. I mean, I think, you know, she's a mother in some sense, but she's not a mother in the same sense that my mother was is my mother or was my mother at the time that I was gestating in her womb. And that seems to make a difference for how we want to think about the different cases and what, you know, not only what responsibilities are brought about as a result of the mother relationship, but also the ways in which the child can say, assuming, you know, certain implausible possibilities, but the way in which the child could say of that person, oh, this is my mother. It doesn't seem to me that the child, that the gestational surrogate paid for mother would be mine, right? In the same way that when I was within my mother's womb, she was mine, right? Or her body was mine. Now, maybe that doesn't make a lot of difference to certain moral questions, right? And obviously it makes no difference to the moral permissibility of killing the child, for instance. And it probably doesn't make much of a difference to I mean, it seems to me that my arguments about treating a resource as one's own under circumstances of extreme need are still going to apply to a fetus who is gestating within the womb of somebody who's being paid to do that. If that person decides that they don't want to and that they just want to evict, it seems to me that still there's this Thomistic argument here that one can make that the fetus is entitled to the use of those without interference by the gestational mother. But it still seems to me that at the end of the day, there's a way in which that although those organs are mine, the maternal, what I'm calling the mother's body, right, is not mine in fully the same way that my mother's body was mine at the time that I was being gestated. Right, it's mine in a more attenuated sense, even if some of the important rights are still the same.
So
you see, I mean,
including the right of the surrogate to keep the baby if she changes her mind.
I doubt that. I mean, if there's no biological, I mean, you know, donor sperm and donor oocyte and a non-biologically related gestational mother who's been paid. I mean, the question of who does have a right when so many rights have been violated to the child in that circumstance is a thorny one, but it doesn't seem to me that it's settled, certainly, by the fact of gestational motherhood. And it doesn't even seem to me that the consideration is, you know, very, very strong, given the motives with which she entered into contractual arrangement and given the biological relationship that exists between the child and two other people. I don't have a well worked out view about how to straighten out the rights relationships in that, but I'm not sure that being a gestational mother is the definitive feature there that does it. Is that what you think, Helen? Do you think that it's?
Well, I suppose I think that, you know, the child has two mothers, unfortunately, and the gestational mother is the last one to be looking after it, and so she has some kind of a claim to continue to do so, because it's bad to break up maternal, maternal periods, and, you know, the genetic mother may have access rights, like a separated father does, but I do think female parenthood, you know, is more complicated than male parenthood, obviously, and it's been fragmented here. And I think continuity's got its own value. So I think it's a good thing if the surrogate mother says, no, I want to keep the baby.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I disagree with that.
Okay.
But I need to think more about it. That's interesting.
On a different point, Chris, in your presentation of, I think it was Stone's argument, you talk about his view that, I don't remember exactly how it's put, but that a kind of organism has a right to the things that it sort of ordinarily needs or uses for its survival, right?
Yeah.
You don't seem to disagree with that, but then when you go on to Wickler's argument and your own argument, you seem to say that just the sort of natural facts of the situation aren't really definitive, but that really what it amounts to is a consideration of reasonableness, and that's what's doing the normative work. So I mean, I wonder if, do you think that any direct normative work is being done by this stipulation in Stone's argument about the things that we ordinarily make use of, or do you think that's only a just kind of indirect thing that gives us an indication about what's required in terms of reasonableness?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, Wickler is more suggestive of the claim that I want to make than Stone is at the end of the day. I think so Stone does seem to want to rest his argument on the species typicality of this particular way of reproducing. And I think that that's more, I mean, of course, species typicality is important because those are the facts that you have to work with, within which you need to make an assessment of what's reasonable. But I don't think, I think that Stone is too quick to get the normative work out of the species typicality of that way of reproducing. And that's really an innovation in Wickler's argument, that, this imaginary dialogue, right? If we're thinking in terms of a world that has these facts about species typical reproduction, right? What's the reasonable way then to divide up the territory of rights? There's a way that's just not reasonable, and that's to give all the rights to the exclusive rights of use to the one who has the heart first. That's just not derived from species typicality, but it's a lot like Aquinas's thought about facts about human nature that lead us to need a scheme of private property, right? If human beings were different, they wouldn't be quarrelsome and lazy and confused with a common scheme of property. But given the way that we are like that, and so we need, reason requires that we have a different way of addressing the situation. So I just think that, I think Stone sets up the problem, but Wickler is the one who actually provides the key there for it. And Wickler actually comes first historically. I mean, it would be possible to write the paper, write stone out of the history of this and just focus on Wickler. But I do think that talking about stone does bring out that the rights in question are largely rights of non-interference. And you can buttress those, and in many circumstances obviously should, with further rights, rights that the fetus has, that the mother, take some sort of care of herself. But those aren't the starting point rights. The starting point right is simply there's a right to use here, and it shouldn't be interfered with. And that is present in stone in a way that I think is helpful. But yeah, that's a good question. That's helpfully spotted. That's not what I, unsurprisingly.
Yes, yeah, I wasn't. Yeah, I kind of knew you wouldn't think the natural facts were
Yeah,
sufficient, but although one thing that just made me think in your answer right now is that imaginary dialogue between alpha and beta and the Wickler argument. I mean, it also seems like what's going on in determining the reasonableness is effectively applying a kind of golden rule or universalizability requirement to the situation.
Yeah, and that is a difference from, I mean, it's at least a partial difference from Aquinas, right? I mean, Aquinas there's a baseline consideration of efficiency. How is it that we're going to efficiently make use of things, given that things are not going to be very efficient if things are held in common? Now, maybe that ultimately also goes back to a golden rule, right? The reason to be efficient is because inevitably inefficiency is unfair to somebody. But this is a much more straightforwardly golden rule based argument. I think that's exactly right. It would just be totally unfair. It would put all the eggs in one basket and leave a whole group of people for no good reason at all disenfranchised from those eggs. And so that's not the scheme that we should adopt. I think that's right.
We're coming to the end, but any very quick comments that anyone else might like to make? No?
Just to say thank you very much for an interesting lecture. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you again for the invitation. It was very enjoyable, and thanks for the comments. Very helpful. I'm still thinking through this, but it'll be helpful in revisions for this volume. So
No, very, very interesting. And thank you very much for coming.
super. Excellent. All right.
Good to see everyone.
Yeah, likewise. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.